The room fell silent when she walked in. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bride, standing at the altar, clutched her bouquet tighter, her perfect smile faltering. The groom's face drained of color. Guests whispered to each other in confusion and shock. There she stood, a striking black woman in a simple yet elegant gown that seemed out of place among the extravagant outfits. Her presence demanded attention, and not just because she was stunning, but because she wasn't supposed to be there. She locked eyes with the rich man sitting in the front row, her only ally in this sea of hostility. His face was a mask of confidence, but his clenched jaw revealed he was bracing for what was to come. Then the bride's mother rose from her seat. "Who let her in here?" she snapped, her voice sharp and loud enough to cut through the murmurs. The woman didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I was invited," she said, her voice steady and calm. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. The groom's face twisted in anger, and the bride looked on the verge of tears. The rich man rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate. "I invited her," he said, his voice booming across the room. The silence that followed was deafening. What happened next would shock everyone and change the course of the day forever. It had all started 2 weeks earlier. Thomas Everett, a man of old money and privilege, was driving through a quiet street in downtown Chicago. He had just learned that his ex-fiancée Heather was getting married. The news didn't sit well with him, not because he still loved her, he didn't, but because he hated how things had ended. Heather's family had always been uptight and judgmental, especially when it came to race and class. They looked down on anyone they deemed unworthy. As Thomas drove, he spotted her. She was sitting on a bench, bundled up in an oversized coat, her belongings in a small, tattered bag at her feet. She looked tired but dignified, her eyes scanning the people who walked by, hoping for a kind face or a warm word. Thomas pulled over and approached her. "Hi," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm Thomas. You okay?" She looked up, wary at first, but his tailored suit and kind eyes made her pause. "I'm fine," she replied, "just trying to get through the day." They talked. Her name was Jasmine, and she had been homeless for nearly a year. She had lost her job due to downsizing and her apartment. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't get back on her feet. Thomas listened, genuinely interested in her story. He was struck by her resilience and grace despite her circumstances. By the end of their conversation, Thomas had an idea. "Jasmine," he said, "how would you like to be my guest at a wedding?" She blinked, taken aback. "A wedding?" "Yes," he said with a smile. "It's my ex's wedding, actually. I think you'd find it interesting." Jasmine hesitated. She wasn't sure what to make of the offer. "Why me?" Thomas chuckled. "Let's just say I need someone who can help me make a point. And I think you're perfect for the job." Jasmine didn't know what to say. It was the strangest proposal she had ever received. But something in Thomas's tone intrigued her. After some thought, she agreed. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas helped Jasmine prepare for the wedding. He took her shopping for a dress, arranged for her to get her hair and makeup done, and even found her a temporary place to stay. Jasmine couldn't believe the transformation. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. The day of the wedding arrived. Thomas and Jasmine arrived at the venue, a grand estate with sprawling gardens and a lavish ballroom. Jasmine felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as they entered. She could feel the stares, the judgment, but she held her head high. Thomas led her to their seats, right in the front row. He could feel the tension in the air but remained calm. He knew what he was doing, and he was ready for whatever came next. The ceremony began, and everything seemed to be going smoothly, until Jasmine made her entrance. Now, with all eyes on her and Thomas standing by her side, the tension reached its peak. The bride's mother was still glaring, the guests were still murmuring, and the bride herself looked like she was about to explode. Thomas knew this was the moment to act. But before he could say anything, Jasmine stepped forward. "I don't mean to cause a scene," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "But I was invited, and I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." The bride's mother scoffed. "You have no idea what kind of event this is. You don't belong here." Jasmine smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, I think I do. And I think it's time we all started questioning who really belongs where." The room was silent again. Thomas felt a surge of pride. Jasmine wasn't just standing her ground. She was challenging the very foundation of the elitist, racist attitudes that had plagued Heather's family for years. And then, without warning, the groom stepped forward, his face red with anger. "This is my wedding," he shouted. "You've ruined everything." Jasmine didn't back down. I think you've ruined it yourselves by building it on lies and exclusion. The bride finally spoke, her voice trembling. Thomas, why did you do this? Thomas met her gaze, his expression unyielding. Because it's time someone held up a mirror to your family's hypocrisy. Just as he finished speaking, the sound of police sirens echoed outside. Everyone froze. The bride's mother looked panicked, and Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Something was about to happen. The doors to the grand estate burst open, and 2 police officers strode in, their expressions unreadable. The room erupted in murmurs again, confusion and unease spreading like wildfire. Who called the police? The bride's father demanded, stepping forward, his face flushed with indignation. One of the officers raised a hand to silence the crowd. We received a report about a disturbance, he said. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Jasmine. Ma'am, could you come with us? Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. Thomas immediately stepped in front of her, his voice firm. What's the meaning of this? The officer gave him a measured look. Sir, we're just doing our job. We need to speak with her outside. Thomas clenched his fists, but before he could argue further, Jasmine placed a hand on his arm. It's okay, she said softly. I'll go. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as Jasmine followed the officers out. Thomas was right behind her, unwilling to let her face whatever this was alone. As they stepped into the crisp afternoon air, the murmurs inside the ballroom faded into a distant hum. Once outside, the officers stopped and turned to Jasmine. We received a call about a suspicious person at this event, one of them said, his tone less formal now that they were away from the crowd. A suspicious person, Thomas repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. She's my guest. What's suspicious about that? The officer glanced at his partner, then back at Thomas. Sir, we're not here to argue. If she's your guest, that clears things up. But we need to make a report to close this. Jasmine's calm facade cracked just a little. You mean someone called you because they didn't like the way I look? The officer hesitated. Ma'am, we don't make judgments. We respond to calls. Thomas was livid. This is outrageous. You're telling me someone here was so offended by her presence that they wasted police resources on this nonsense. The officer didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Jasmine felt a familiar sting, a reminder of the countless times she'd been judged or dismissed because of her appearance, but she refused to let it break her. Fine, she said. Let's get this over with. The officers took down some basic information, apologizing for the inconvenience before leaving. Thomas turned to Jasmine, his anger simmering just below the surface. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. Jasmine shrugged, though her eyes betrayed her weariness. It's not the first time. Thomas shook his head. It shouldn't happen at all. They re-entered the ballroom, the atmosphere now thick with unease. The guests tried to act as if nothing had happened, but their stolen glances and whispered conversations gave them away. Jasmine walked with her head held high, but the weight of the incident lingered. The ceremony resumed, though the tension was palpable. Thomas couldn't focus on the vows or the music. His mind kept replaying the scene outside, the blatant racism that had just unfolded. He knew Heather's family had their prejudices, but this was a new low. As the officiant pronounced the couple married, the crowd erupted in applause, though it felt forced. Jasmine clapped politely, her face a mask of calm. But Thomas could see the flicker of pain in her eyes. The reception followed, a lavish affair with a live band, gourmet food, and an open bar. Jasmine stayed close to Thomas, both of them aware of the stares they continued to draw. Some guests avoided them entirely, while others approached with strained smiles, trying to mask their discomfort. One guest, an older woman with a sharp gaze, stopped by their table. Thomas, she said with a thin smile, you've certainly brought an interesting guest. Thomas returned her smile with one of his own, though it didn't reach his eyes. Jasmine is more than interesting. She's remarkable. The woman's smile faltered. Yes, well, I suppose we all have our ways of making statements. Jasmine didn't miss the underlying insult, but she refused to take the bait. It's been a lovely event, she said, her voice even. Thank you for your hospitality. The woman gave a tight nod before walking away. Thomas exhaled, his frustration evident. These people are insufferable. Jasmine placed a hand on his. You can't change them overnight. Thomas sighed. Maybe not, but I won't let them ruin today for you. For a while, they tried to enjoy the reception. Jasmine admired the floral arrangements, listened to the band, and even danced with Thomas. For brief moments, she felt like any other guest, but the incident with the police loomed over her. As the evening wore on, Heather approached their table. She looked exhausted, her perfect makeup slightly smudged. "Thomas," she said, her voice low. "Can we talk?" Thomas nodded, though he glanced at Jasmine before stepping away with Heather. They walked to a quiet corner of the room, away from prying eyes. Heather folded her arms, her expression conflicted. "Why did you bring her here?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Because she deserves to be here as much as anyone else." Heather sighed. "You knew how my family would react." "That's exactly why I did it," Thomas said. "Your family needs a wake-up call." Heather looked away, her eyes glistening. "I don't agree with everything they say or do, but this was my wedding, Thomas. You made it about your crusade." Thomas' expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "Heather, if standing up for what's right makes people uncomfortable, maybe that's a sign something needs to change." Heather shook her head, tears threatening to fall. "You've always been stubborn. And you've always been afraid to stand up to them," Thomas said gently. "But it's never too late to start." Heather didn't respond. She wiped her eyes and walked away, leaving Thomas alone in the corner. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before returning to Jasmine. Before he could sit down, a loud crash echoed through the room. Everyone turned to see a table overturned, food and drinks scattered across the floor. In the center of the chaos stood a man, clearly drunk, pointing a finger at Jasmine. "This is your fault," he slurred. "You don't belong here." The room erupted in chaos as guests tried to calm him down. Jasmine stood, her hands clenched at her sides, her face a mask of control. Thomas rushed to her side, glaring at the man. "That's enough?" Thomas shouted. The man sneered. "You think bringing her here makes you some kind of hero? You're just as pathetic as she is." Before anyone could react, another crash sounded, and the situation spiraled further out of control. The second crash was louder, more violent. A chair had been thrown against the wall, splintering on impact. Gasps filled the room as the drunken man staggered, his rage unchecked. Thomas positioned himself in front of Jasmine, his voice a low warning. "You've had too much to drink. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." The man sneered, his face twisted with disdain. "Embarrass myself? You're the one dragging this." He gestured wildly at Jasmine. "Into our world." Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. She had faced worse. "I'm not going to let you ruin this evening," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. The man laughed bitterly. "Oh, you've already done that just by showing up." Heather and her new husband, Mark, rushed to the scene. Mark grabbed the drunken man by the arm, trying to pull him away. "Jason, you're out of line. Stop this, now." Jason shook him off, stumbling slightly but refusing to back down. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." He pointed at the crowd, his words slurring. "You're all too scared to say it, but you know I'm right." The room fell into a tense silence. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to step in and put an end to the madness. Thomas had enough. "You're not right, Jason. You're just a coward who hides behind his ignorance." Jason's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Thomas shot back. "And I know Jasmine is worth 10 of you." The insult struck its mark. Jason lunged forward, his fist raised, but Mark and another guest grabbed him, pulling him back before he could get any closer. "Get him out of here," Heather snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "I won't have this at my wedding." Jason struggled against the hands restraining him, but he was no match for the combined effort of Mark and the other guest. As they dragged him toward the exit, he shouted over his shoulder, "You'll regret this, Heather. You'll all regret it." The doors slammed shut behind him, leaving the ballroom in stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly the murmurs began again, guests whispering to one another, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Heather turned to Jasmine, her face a mix of embarrassment and exhaustion. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. Jasmine nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's not your fault." Heather opened her mouth to say more, but Thomas stepped in. "Heather, maybe you should focus on your guests. Jasmine and I will be fine." Heather hesitated, then gave a small nod before retreating to the other side of the room with Mark. The tension in the air was still thick, but slowly the festivities resumed. The band played a soft tune, and waiters moved through the crowd, refilling glasses and clearing away the remnants of the overturned table. Thomas and Jasmine returned to their seats. He leaned in close, his voice low. "Are you okay?" Jasmine gave him a small, tired smile. "I'm fine. This isn't the first time I've dealt with someone like Jason." Thomas frowned. "It shouldn't have happened at all." Jasmine reached for her glass of water, her hands steady despite the storm they had just weathered. You can't control how people think, Thomas, but you can control how you respond. He admired her strength, her ability to rise above the hatred and ignorance. You handled that with more grace than most people could. Jasmine chuckled softly, years of practice. The evening wore on, and while the atmosphere remained strained, the worst seemed to be over. Guests gradually returned to their conversations, though many still cast furtive glances toward Jasmine and Thomas. Then came the toasts. Mark's best man stood and gave a heartfelt speech about friendship and love. Heather's maid of honor followed with a tearful tribute to the bride. Everyone clapped politely, the tension from earlier beginning to fade. Finally, Heather's father rose, glass in hand. The room fell silent again. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Thomas and Jasmine. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, his tone measured. "First, I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate this union. It means a great deal to our family." Polite applause followed, but the air grew heavier with each word. Heather's father took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "It's no secret," he continued, "that today has not gone entirely as planned. We've had unexpected challenges." Thomas bristled, his eyes narrowing. He could feel where this was heading. Heather's father turned his full attention to Jasmine. "I won't pretend to understand all the choices people make, but I believe that events like these are meant to bring people together. That's what family is about." The words were veiled, but the intent was clear. Jasmine met his gaze without flinching. "Family is also about acceptance," she said, her voice steady, "and standing by each other no matter what." Heather's father stiffened slightly but forced a smile. "Of course," he said, raising his glass. "To the bride and groom." "To the bride and groom," the guests echoed, though the enthusiasm was muted. As everyone drank, Thomas leaned closer to Jasmine. "That was his version of an apology," he murmured. Jasmine smirked. "I've seen worse." The rest of the reception passed without incident, though the lingering unease never fully dissipated. Thomas and Jasmine stayed until the end, determined not to let anyone drive them away. As they prepared to leave, Heather approached them once more. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice sincere. "Despite everything, I'm glad you were here." Thomas nodded. "You've got a lot to think about, Heather. I hope today opened your eyes." Heather gave a small, sad smile. It did. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Jasmine sighed, her breath visible in the chill. That was intense. Thomas laughed, though there was little humor in it, to say the least. They walked in silence for a while, the events of the day replaying in their minds. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Jasmine, I'm sorry for putting you through that." She shook her head. "You didn't put me through anything, Thomas. I chose to come, and I'm glad I did." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You're incredible, you know that." Jasmine smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "So are you." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of footsteps behind them made them turn. A figure emerged from the shadows, and their hearts stopped. It was Jason, and he wasn't alone. Jason's staggering figure emerged under the faint glow of the estate's lanterns, his drunken sway now supported by two equally imposing men. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold, and it was clear they hadn't come to talk. Well, Jason slurred, an ugly grin spreading across his face. "Leaving so soon? We weren't done." Thomas stepped in front of Jasmine instinctively, his body tensing. "You've had enough for one night, Jason. Go home." Jason chuckled darkly, his laughter echoing off the stone driveway. "Home? Not before we settle this." He gestured to the two men, who stepped forward, cracking their knuckles. Jasmine's heart raced, but she refused to let fear take over. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're making a fool of yourself." Jason's grin twisted into a sneer. "The only fool here is the one thinking she belongs in our world." Thomas's voice was like steel. "Jason, walk away now or you'll regret it." Jason scoffed, taking another unsteady step forward. "You think you can threaten me? You've always been this self-righteous type, Thomas, but you're not better than me." One of Jason's men lunged, but Thomas was ready. He sidestepped the attack and delivered a swift punch to the man's gut, sending him stumbling back. The second man moved in, aiming for Jasmine, but she dodged, her reflexes sharp. Without missing a beat, she grabbed a loose piece of wood from the ground and held it up defensively. "Stay back," she warned, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through her. The man hesitated for a moment, clearly underestimating her, but Jason barked, "Get her!" Before the man could act, Thomas grabbed him by the collar and shoved him away. "Touch her, and you'll have to deal with me." Jason, now fuming, blunted Thomas. The two men grappled, their scuffle a mix of drunken swings and calculated strikes. Thomas had the upper hand, his sober focus allowing him to land precise blows. Jason, however, fought dirty, managing to land a wild punch to Thomas's jaw. Jasmine watched in horror, her mind racing. She had to do something. Without overthinking, she swung the piece of wood, hitting Jason's arm hard enough to make him yelp and release Thomas. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice ringing out into the night. Jason staggered back, clutching his arm, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "You'll regret that," he growled, but his bravado was crumbling. The sound of distant footsteps and shouting reached them. Someone from the estate had heard the commotion and was coming to investigate. Jason's eyes darted toward the noise, panic flickering across his face. "We're done here," he muttered, signaling to his men. "Let's go." The three of them disappeared into the shadows, leaving Thomas and Jasmine standing in the driveway, breathing heavily. Moments later, a security guard arrived, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Is everything okay?" the guard asked, his eyes scanning the area. Thomas nodded, wiping a bit of blood from his lip. "We're fine. Just some unwanted guests." The guard frowned but didn't press further. "You should head out. I'll make sure they don't come back." "Thanks," Thomas said, his voice tight. As the guard walked away, Thomas turned to Jasmine. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "I'm fine. You?" He smiled wryly, touching his bruised jaw. "I've had worse." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what just happened settling in. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Let's get out of here." Jasmine didn't argue. They got into Thomas's car, the tension lingering as he started the engine and pulled onto the road. The silence between them was heavy, each lost in their thoughts. After a while, Jasmine spoke softly. "Why do people like him think they can treat others that way?" Thomas sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Because they've never been held accountable. They've lived their whole lives believing they're untouchable." Jasmine stared out the window, the city lights blurring as they passed. "It's exhausting," she said quietly. "Always having to prove yourself, always being on guard." Thomas reached over, placing a comforting hand on hers. "You shouldn't have to. None of this is fair." Jasmine gave him a small, grateful smile but didn't say anything more. The rest of the drive was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached Jasmine's temporary apartment, Thomas walked her to the door. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Jasmine shook her head. "I'll be okay. You've done more than enough." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "If you need anything, call me. Anytime." "I will," Jasmine said, her voice soft. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." He gave her a small smile before turning and heading back to his car. Jasmine watched him drive away, a mix of gratitude and unease settling over her. Inside, she locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. She had thought the worst was over, but tonight had proven otherwise, and something told her that Jason wasn't done causing trouble. She just didn't know how far he was willing to go. This content may violate our usage policies. Did we get it wrong? Please tell us by giving this response a thumbs down. The next morning, Jasmine woke to the sound of her phone vibrating on the bedside table. She rubbed her eyes and reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was a text from Thomas. "Thomas, morning, just checking in. How are you feeling?" She smiled faintly at his concern and quickly typed a response. "Jasmine, I'm fine, just a little tired. How about you?" His reply came almost instantly. "Thomas, same, rest up today. We'll talk later." Jasmine set the phone down and sighed. She appreciated Thomas's support, but last night's events lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jason wasn't the type to let things go. She pushed herself out of bed and went about her morning routine, trying to shake off the unease. By mid-morning, she felt a bit more like herself. Determined not to let fear control her, she decided to go for a walk. The crisp autumn air helped clear her head as she wandered through the quiet streets. As she passed a coffee shop, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. Her hair was neatly braided, her face calm but focused. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, secure, with a steady job and a bright future. Life had taken a sharp turn since then, but she was still standing. That counted for something. She stepped inside the coffee shop, ordered a cup of tea, and found a seat by the window. The warmth of the drink and the soft hum of conversation around her brought a sense of normalcy. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax. But the peace didn't last. As she scrolled through her phone, her heart sank. A news article popped up on her feed, and the headline made her stomach twist. Incident at High Society Wedding Sparks Controversy. Jasmine's hands trembled as she clicked the link. The article detailed the events of the previous night, painting her as an uninvited guest who had caused a scene. It didn't name her directly, but the descriptions left little doubt. Her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She had expected whispers, maybe a few disapproving comments, but this, a public spectacle. Before she could process it fully, her phone buzzed with another message. This one was from an unknown number. Unknown. Saw the news. You're famous now. Hope you're ready for what's coming. Jasmine stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Who was this? Her thoughts immediately went to Jason. Could he be behind this? She saved the number and forwarded the message to Thomas with a quick note. Jasmine, look at this. I think Jason is trying to intimidate me. A few minutes later, her phone rang. It was Thomas. Jasmine, are you okay? He asked, his voice laced with concern. I'm fine, she said, though her voice wavered slightly. But this is getting out of hand. Did you see the article? I did, Thomas said, his tone dark. It's garbage. They're twisting everything to fit their narrative. Jasmine sighed. And now this text. What if Jason's planning something worse? Thomas was silent for a moment. We'll handle it, he said finally. I'll make some calls, see if I can get that article taken down. As for Jason, we'll need to be careful. He's not someone to take lightly. I don't want to drag you into this any more than I already have, Jasmine said. You're not dragging me into anything, Thomas said firmly. We're in this together. Don't forget that. His words brought her some comfort, but the knot in her stomach remained. After they hung up, Jasmine decided she couldn't sit around waiting for the next attack. She needed to take control of the situation. She spent the afternoon researching legal options, reaching out to advocacy groups, and drafting a statement to set the record straight. If Jason and his cronies thought they could silence her, they were in for a surprise. As the day wore on, she felt a renewed sense of determination. But just as she was beginning to feel in control, another text came through from the same unknown number. Unknown, you think you can hide behind Thomas? You've got no idea who you're dealing with. The message sent a chill down her spine. Whoever this was, they were watching her closely. She forwarded it to Thomas again, her fingers shaking slightly. His response was swift. Thomas, stay where you are. I'm coming over. True to his word, Thomas arrived within the hour. He looked tense, his usual calm replaced by a simmering anger. I'm not going to let him scare you, he said as he entered. We'll report this to the police. Jasmine nodded. But will they take it seriously? After what happened last night, I'm not sure they'll be on my side. They'll have to, Thomas said, his jaw set. I'll make sure of it. They spent the next hour at the police station, filing a report and sharing the messages. The officers listened, but their responses were lukewarm at best. We'll look into it, one officer said, his tone dismissive. As they left the station, Jasmine couldn't hide her frustration. They don't care. They will, Thomas said, especially when I get my lawyers involved. Jasmine appreciated his confidence, but the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her. As they walked back to the car, a sudden noise made them both stop. A car sped past them, its tires screeching as it rounded the corner. For a brief moment, Jasmine thought it was just another reckless driver. But then she saw it, a brick, hurled from the car, smashing into the window of a nearby storefront. Thomas pulled her back instinctively as glass shattered onto the sidewalk. The car disappeared down the street, its taillights vanishing into the distance. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. Do you think? Thomas nodded grimly. It's a message, and it's just the beginning. The shattered glass sparkled under the streetlights, and the sound of distant sirens grew louder. Thomas pulled Jasmine further away from the scene, his eyes scanning their surroundings. He wasn't taking any chances. We need to get out of here, he said, his voice low but urgent. Jasmine nodded, her pulse racing. But what about the store? The cops will handle it. We're not safe here. They hurried to Thomas's car, parked a few blocks away. As soon as they were inside, he locked the doors and started the engine, his grip on the wheel tight. The atmosphere in the car was thick with tension. Neither of them spoke as Thomas navigated through the city streets. Jasmine stared out the window, her thoughts racing. Who could be driving this escalation? Was Jason orchestrating this alone, or was someone else involved? Finally, Thomas broke the silence. This isn't random, he said. Jason's making it personal. Jasmine looked over at him, her brows furrowed. But why go this far? A smashed window? Threatening texts? It's like he's trying to wear us down. Thomas clenched his jaw. Because people like Jason don't know how to lose. When their control is threatened, they lash out. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, her mind flashing back to the wedding. Jason's rage, the disdain in his eyes. It was clear he saw her as a threat. But this went beyond mere hatred. This was calculated. Thomas pulled into the underground garage of his apartment building and parked. He turned to Jasmine, his expression serious. You're staying here tonight. It's safer than your place. Jasmine hesitated. I don't want to inconvenience you. You're not, Thomas said firmly. Besides, I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you. His sincerity left no room for argument. Jasmine nodded, and they headed upstairs. Thomas's apartment was spacious but minimal, with large windows that overlooked the city. Jasmine had only been here once before, but tonight it felt different, like a sanctuary. You can take the guest room, Thomas said, leading her down the hallway. Make yourself at home. Jasmine smiled faintly. Thanks, Thomas, for everything. He gave her a reassuring nod before retreating to his own room. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily for Jasmine. She lay awake, her mind replaying the events of the day, the article, the texts, the brick. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jason's sneering face. After what felt like hours, she finally drifted off, only to be awakened by a faint noise. She sat up, her heart pounding. It took her a moment to realize what it was. Thomas's voice, low and tense, coming from the living room. Quietly, she got out of bed and crept down the hallway. She found Thomas pacing near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. I don't care how much it costs, he was saying, his tone sharp. I want this handled now. Jasmine stepped into the room, and Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. I'll call you back, he said into the phone before hanging up. Couldn't sleep, he asked, his voice quieter now. Jasmine shook her head. Neither could you, apparently. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been making calls, trying to get ahead of this. Did you find anything out? Jasmine asked. Not much, Thomas admitted. But I've got a security team looking into Jason's recent activities. If he's planning something bigger, we'll know soon. Jasmine nodded, but the sense of foreboding didn't lift. Thomas, what if this doesn't stop? What if Jason keeps escalating? Thomas walked over to her, his expression resolute. Then we'll fight back. Together. His words were meant to reassure her, but before either of them could say more, Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. What is it? Jasmine asked, her anxiety spiking. It's from one of my security contacts, Thomas said, reading the message aloud. Jason was seen meeting with someone at a private club downtown. They're looking into who it was. Jasmine frowned. He's not working alone. It looks that way, Thomas said, his voice grim. And whoever he's working with, they've got resources. The implications were chilling. Jasmine wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the creeping sense of vulnerability. Thomas stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. We'll figure this out, he said softly. You're not alone in this. Jasmine took a deep breath, drawing strength from his presence. I know. Thank you. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence, both of them too alert to sleep. When morning finally came, they were greeted by a fresh wave of chaos. Thomas's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from his lawyer. What's going on? He asked as he answered. The lawyer's voice was calm but urgent. Thomas, you need to see this. Someone leaked photos from the wedding, specifically of you and your guest. Thomas's stomach sank. Photos. How bad is it? Bad, the lawyer replied. They're all over social media, along with some choice commentary. It's going viral. Thomas hung up and quickly pulled up his phone. Jasmine moved closer, her heart pounding as she watched over his shoulder. The images were everywhere, her walking into the wedding, sitting next to Thomas, and even the moment she confronted Jason. But the captions were worse, filled with racist and classist slurs, painting Jasmine as an intruder and Thomas as a traitor to his kind. Jasmine's hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. They're tearing us apart. Thomas' expression hardened. Then it's time we show them the truth. He opened his social media account and began typing, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Jasmine watched as he crafted a powerful statement, calling out the lies and defending Jasmine's presence at the wedding. Before he posted it, he looked at her. Are you okay with this? Jasmine hesitated but then nodded. Yes, it's time people heard our side. Thomas hit post, and within minutes, the responses began pouring in. Some were supportive, but others were vicious. The battle had officially gone public. As they sat together, watching the fallout unfold, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, and the next move was Jason's. The fallout from Thomas's post spread like wildfire. By noon, media outlets had picked up the story, and #wedding scandal was trending across social platforms. Some headlines sided with Thomas, praising his bravery for standing up against bigotry. Others were less kind, twisting the narrative to paint Jasmine as an opportunist who had manipulated her way into high society. Jasmine couldn't look away from her phone, despite the growing pit in her stomach. The hateful comments stung, but what cut deeper were the subtle jabs disguised as concern. Why did she even go to a wedding where she clearly wasn't wanted? Thomas means well, but he's ruining his reputation over this. Thomas sat beside her, scrolling through the endless feed. "Don't pay attention to them," he said, his voice firm. "They don't know you." Jasmine nodded, but the words were easier said than followed. "It's just overwhelming," she admitted. "I never asked for any of this." Thomas reached over and gently took her hand. "I know, but you don't have to face it alone." The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Both of them froze, exchanging wary glances. "Expecting anyone?" Jasmine whispered. Thomas shook his head and stood. "Stay here." He walked to the door and peered through the peephole. His posture relaxed slightly. "It's Heather." Jasmine's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Heather?" Thomas opened the door, and Heather stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She wore dark sunglasses and a scarf, clearly trying to stay under the radar. "I'm sorry for just showing up," Heather said, her voice strained, "but we need to talk." Thomas gestured for her to sit. "What's going on?" Heather hesitated, glancing at Jasmine. "First, I want to apologize. For everything. The way my family treated you, the things Jason said, none of it was right." Jasmine gave a small nod, her expression cautious. "Thank you." Heather sighed and removed her sunglasses. "There's more. Jason's been spiraling since the wedding. He's convinced you're trying to ruin him, Thomas. He's obsessed." Thomas frowned. That much was obvious when he showed up with goons last night. Heather's eyes widened. "What? He did what?" Thomas quickly recounted the incident, and Heather's face turned pale. "That's worse than I thought," she said. "He's not just angry, he's dangerous." "What else do you know?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. Heather hesitated again, then lowered her voice. "Jason's been meeting with someone, an old business associate of my father's. This man, Carter Hill, has a reputation for handling unsavory matters." "Carter Hill," Thomas repeated, his expression darkening. "I've heard of him. He's practically a fixer for the elite." Heather nodded. "Exactly. If Jason's working with him, it means he's planning something big." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of something?" Heather shook her head. "I don't know, but it can't be good. That's why I'm here. I want to help." Thomas crossed his arms, his gaze skeptical. "Why now, Heather? You've never stood up to your family before." Heather flinched, but didn't back down. "Because this time, it's gone too far, and because I owe you." The room fell silent for a moment. Jasmine studied Heather's face, searching for any signs of deceit, but all she saw was genuine remorse. "Okay," Thomas said finally. "What do you suggest?" Heather pulled out a small notebook from her bag. "I've been keeping tabs on Jason's movements since the wedding. If we can find out what he's planning, we might be able to stop him before it's too late." Thomas took the notebook, flipping through the pages. "This is a good start," he admitted, "but we'll need more." Heather nodded. "I can try to get more information. Jason still trusts me barely. But we have to move fast. If he finds out I'm helping you—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. "We'll be careful," Thomas assured her. "And thank you, Heather. I mean it." Heather managed a small smile. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go." After Heather left, Jasmine and Thomas pored over the notebook. It contained detailed notes on Jason's meetings, including times, locations, and names. One entry stood out: a meeting scheduled for the next day at an exclusive club downtown. "This could be our chance," Thomas said, tapping the page. "If we can figure out what they're discussing, we'll have leverage." "How do we get in?" Jasmine asked. "It's not like they'll just let us walk in and eavesdrop." Thomas's eyes lit up with determination. "We won't have to. I know someone who can help." Later that evening, Thomas made a call to a private investigator he had worked with in the past. The man, a grizzled veteran named Dan, agreed to meet them first thing in the morning. The next day, they met Dan at a small cafe. He was a no-nonsense type, with sharp eyes and a gruff demeanor. "So you went intel on Jason and his buddy Carter," Dan said, stirring his coffee. "Tricky, but not impossible." "We need to know what they're planning," Thomas explained. "They're meeting at the Highland Club tomorrow night." Dan nodded, jotting down notes in a small pad. "I'll set up surveillance. Might take some time, but if they're discussing anything serious, I'll find out." Jasmine leaned forward. "Can you get in without them noticing?" Dan smirked. "Getting in is the easy part. Staying unnoticed is where the real challenge begins. But don't worry, I've got my methods." As they finalized the details, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a tightrope. Every step brought them closer to the truth, but it also increased the risk. And Jason wasn't the type to back down without a fight. That night, as they prepared for what lay ahead, Thomas received another text from an unknown number. This time, it was a photo of Jasmine and Thomas sitting in the cafe with Dan. The caption read, "You're playing a dangerous game." Thomas stared at the photo, his grip tightening on the phone. "They're watching us," he said, his voice low but filled with anger. Jasmine moved closer, her heart pounding. "How is that even possible? We were careful." Thomas shook his head, his mind racing. "Jason's not working alone, remember? Cartergill's people are probably tailing us." Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "What do we do now? If they know we're investigating, they'll be more careful." Thomas nodded. "We'll stick to the plan, but we'll have to assume they're monitoring us. Every move has to count." Just then, his phone buzzed again. It was a text from Dan. "Dan, got the same photo. They know I'm on the case, but that doesn't change anything. I'll still get the intel." Thomas showed the message to Jasmine. "At least, Dan's not spooked." "He's braver than I'd be," Jasmine admitted, though her respect for the investigator grew. The next day passed in tense anticipation. Thomas and Jasmine stayed at the apartment, going over Heather's notes and trying to piece together Jason's next move. The hours dragged, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. By the time night fell, the air was electric with suspense. Dan sent a final message confirming his position at the Highland Club. "Dan, I'm inside. Earpiece is live. I'll feed you updates." Thomas and Jasmine sat in the living room, a laptop open on the coffee table. Through a secure connection, they could hear everything Dan picked up from the club. His voice came through the speakers, low and steady. "I've got eyes on Jason," Dan murmured. "He's sitting with Cartergill. Looks like they're waiting for someone." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Stay with them." Minutes passed in agonizing silence until Dan spoke again. "Third party just arrived. A woman, late 40s, professional look. They seem to know her." "Who is she?" Thomas asked, more to himself than anyone. Dan's voice turned thoughtful. "Hang on, I'll try to catch some names." The sound of muffled conversation filled the room, Dan's earpiece picking up bits and pieces of the discussion. Jasmine strained to hear, her nerves on edge. "Shipment, schedule moved up, secure the funds." Dan's voice cut back in. "They're talking about a shipment. Sounds like something big, but they're being careful not to say too much." Thomas frowned. "What kind of shipment?" "I'm not sure yet," Dan admitted. "But it's enough to make Carter nervous. He just asked about the backup plan." Jasmine exchanged a glance with Thomas. "Backup plan? That doesn't sound good." The conversation in the club continued, fragments of dialogue floating through the speakers. "If the press gets wind, need a scapegoat. We'll make sure it's airtight." Dan's voice came through again, more urgent this time. "They're talking about media fallout. Whatever the shipment is, it's sensitive, and they're planning to cover their tracks if something goes wrong." Thomas clenched his fists. "This isn't just about revenge. Jason and Carter are involved in something illegal." Jasmine nodded. "If we can prove it, we can stop them." The tension in the room escalated as the conversation in the club grew more heated. Dan kept feeding updates, his voice calm but focused. "Jason's getting agitated," he said. "He's talking about needing to shut you down, Thomas. He mentioned your name specifically." Thomas exhaled sharply. "What else is he saying?" Dan paused, then continued. "He just said they need to send a message. Carter's trying to calm him down, but Jason's not having it." Jasmine felt a chill. "What kind of message?" Before Dan could respond, the audio crackled, and a new voice broke in, a woman's, smooth and commanding. "We'll handle Everett," she said. "But first, we deal with the girl." Jasmine's blood ran cold. "They're talking about me?" Thomas's face darkened. They won't touch you. I won't let them. Dan's voice came back, more urgent now. They're wrapping up. I'll follow Carter, see where he goes next. Be careful, Thomas said. I always am, Dan replied. The feed went quiet for a moment, leaving Thomas and Jasmine to process what they had just heard. The danger was more real than ever, and Jason's obsession with them was spiraling out of control. Thomas stood and began pacing, his mind racing. We need more than just overheard conversations. We need hard evidence, something that ties Jason and Carter to this shipment. Jasmine nodded. But how do we get that? If Dan gets too close, they'll know. Thomas stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. We'll find a way. We have to. As they strategized, Dan's voice returned. I'm trailing Carter now. He's heading to a warehouse on the east side. Looks like this is where the shipment's being kept. Thomas grabbed his keys. We're going there. Jasmine hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? What, it's a trap? It might be, Thomas admitted. But we can't sit around waiting for them to come after us. We need to stay ahead of them. Reluctantly, Jasmine agreed. They left the apartment and drove to the location Dan had mentioned, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. As they pulled up near the warehouse, Dan's voice crackled through the phone. Carter just went inside. Looks like security's tight. Armed guards at the entrance. Thomas parked the car a safe distance away, his mind racing. We need to find another way in. Jasmine scanned the perimeter. What about the side entrance? It looks less guarded. Thomas nodded. Good eye. Let's go. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they approached the side of the building. The warehouse loomed before them, its dim lights casting eerie shadows across the pavement. As they reached the side door, Thomas pulled out a small toolkit and began working on the lock. Jasmine kept watch, her ears straining for any sound of movement. Just as the lock clicked open, the faint sound of footsteps reached them. Jasmine's heart jumped. Someone's coming, she whispered. Thomas pushed the door open and gestured for her to go inside. Hurry. They slipped into the warehouse, the door closing softly behind them. The interior was dimly lit, rows of crates and pallets stretching into the distance. Dan's voice came through the earpiece. You're inside? Good, be careful. I'll try to distract the guards if I can. Thomas and Jasmine moved quietly through the maze of crates, their eyes scanning for anything that might give them a clue about the shipment. Then, they found it, a large crate marked with the name of a shipping company and a label that read hazardous material. Before they could investigate further, the sound of voices echoed through the warehouse. We're not alone, Thomas muttered. They ducked behind the crate, their hearts pounding. The voices grew louder, and then to their horror, the unmistakable figure of Jason appeared, flanked by two armed men. I know you're here, Jason called out, his voice filled with menace. Come out, and maybe I'll make this quick. Jasmine clenched her fists, her mind racing. They were trapped. Jason's voice echoed through the warehouse, bouncing off the metal walls like a cruel taunt. You really thought you could sneak in here unnoticed? He sneered. His footsteps drew closer, deliberate and unhurried. Thomas, you've always been arrogant, but this is a new level of stupidity. Thomas pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Jasmine to stay quiet. They crouched behind the large crate, hearts pounding. Every second felt like an eternity as Jason and his armed men prowled the aisles. We'll find you, Jason continued, his tone almost sing-song. And when we do, you'll regret ever crossing me. Jasmine's mind raced. She scanned their hiding spot for anything they could use as a weapon. The crate's lid was slightly ajar, revealing a collection of metal canisters inside. They were labeled with symbols indicating flammability. A dangerous idea formed in her mind. She whispered to Thomas, barely audible. If we can create a distraction, we might be able to get out of here. Thomas nodded, understanding immediately. What are you thinking? Jasmine pointed to the canisters. We tip one over, make it spill near their path. It might slow them down. Thomas hesitated, then gave her a determined look. Let's do it. Carefully they worked together to nudge one of the canisters toward the edge of the crate. It wobbled, teetering on the brink. Jason's voice grew louder, accompanied by the sound of boots on the concrete floor. Check every row, he ordered. They're close. With a final push, the canister fell, hitting the ground with a loud clang. The liquid inside began to spill, its pungent chemical smell filling the air. Jason's men were instantly on alert. What was that? One of them barked. Jason held up a hand, signaling them to stop. Be careful, he said. That smell, it's something flammable. Thomas grabbed Jasmine's hand, and they slipped further into the maze of crates while Jason and his men cautiously approached the fallen canister. "Fan out," Jason instructed. "Find them, but don't shoot near this stuff. The last thing we need is a fire." The armed men spread out, their steps more careful now. Thomas and Jasmine crept through the narrow pathways, their escape route becoming clearer. But just as they neared another exit, a voice called out behind them. "There they are." Jason's men gave chase, their heavy boots pounding against the floor. Thomas and Jasmine sprinted, weaving through the maze of crates. One of the men raised his gun, but before he could fire, Dan's voice came crackling through the earpiece. "Get down now." Without hesitation, Thomas and Jasmine dove behind a stack of crates as a loud bang echoed through the warehouse. Sparks flew from the other side of the room, followed by a sharp crack and a burst of smoke. "Fireworks," Thomas muttered, realizing Dan had set off some kind of distraction. Good timing. Jason's men hesitated, momentarily confused by the sudden explosion of light and noise. Jason, however, was not so easily thrown off. "Idiots, focus," he roared. "They're heading for the back exit." Thomas pulled Jasmine to her feet. "We need to move, now." They dashed toward the exit, but just as they reached the door, it burst open. Another armed guard stood there, blocking their path. He aimed his gun, his eyes cold and steady. "Don't move," he said. Jasmine froze, her heart pounding in her ears. Thomas raised his hand slowly, his mind racing for a solution. The guard stepped closer, his finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could act, a loud thud sounded behind him. He staggered, his weapon falling from his hands as he crumpled to the ground. Behind him stood Dan, holding a heavy wrench. "Go!" Dan shouted, tossing the wrench aside. Thomas and Jasmine didn't hesitate. They bolted through the now clear exit, Dan right behind them. The cool night air hit their faces as they emerged from the warehouse, but they didn't stop running until they were well away from the building. Finally, they ducked into a nearby alley, breathing heavily. Dan leaned against the wall, a small smirk on his face. "You're welcome." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. Perfect timing as always. Jasmine looked back toward the warehouse, her chest still heaving. "You think they'll follow us?" Dan shook his head. "Not right away. They've got their hands full dealing with that little surprise I left them." Thomas' expression darkened. "We still don't know exactly what they're planning, but we do know it's big, and they're willing to go to any lengths to protect it." Dan nodded. "We'll need more than what we heard tonight, but at least now we have a lead." Jasmine frowned. "What kind of lead?" Dan pulled out his phone and showed them a photo he had taken inside the warehouse. It was a close-up of a document on Carter's table, partially obscured, but with enough visible to make out key details. "This," Dan said, pointing to the image. "Shipping manifests. If we can track these, we'll know exactly what they're moving and where it's going." Thomas' eyes lit up with determination. "That's our next move." Jasmine nodded, though a sense of dread lingered. They had escaped tonight, but Jason wasn't done. She could feel it. "Let's get out of here," Dan said. "We'll regroup and figure out our next steps." As they left the alley and headed toward Thomas's car, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a potential danger. And she was right. From a dark corner near the warehouse, Jason watched them go, his expression twisted with rage. His plans might have been temporarily derailed, but he wasn't beaten. Not yet. "They'll pay for this," he muttered to himself, pulling out his phone. Time to bring in reinforcements. The night air buzzed with tension as Jason's call connected. "It's me," he said, his voice low and simmering with anger. They were at the warehouse. They saw enough to cause problems. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached. "How much do they know?" Jason paced in the shadows, his fists clenched. "Enough to trace the shipment. We need to act fast." There was a pause, then the voice replied, "Understood. I'll mobilize additional assets. We can't afford any interference at this stage." Jason's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Good. Let's make sure they regret ever crossing us." He ended the call and stepped further into the darkness, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. Meanwhile, Thomas, Jasmine, and Dan returned to Thomas' apartment, the weight of their narrow escape still heavy on their minds. Once inside, they locked the doors and closed the blinds, creating a small fortress of safety. Dan set his bag down and pulled out his laptop. "Let's see what we'd got," he said, plugging in a flash drive containing the photos he'd taken. The screen lit up with images of the shipping manifest, partially obscured but still revealing key details. Thomas and Jasmine leaned in, studying the documents closely. There, Jasmine said, pointing to a line of text. That's the name of the shipping company. Thomas nodded, quickly typing it into his own laptop. Let's see where their shipments have been going. After a few tense minutes of searching, Thomas found what they were looking for. Here it is, he said. They've been sending cargo to a private dock on the river, just outside the city. Dan whistled softly. That's remote enough to avoid prying eyes. Jasmine frowned. What kind of shipment needs that level of secrecy? Thomas' expression darkened. Something illegal. Maybe weapons. Maybe something worse. Dan nodded. Whatever it is, they're going to extreme lengths to keep it under wraps. Jasmine sat back, her mind racing. If we can get to that dock, we might be able to gather enough evidence to stop them. Thomas nodded. It's risky, but it might be our best shot. Dan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. We'll need a plan. Security at a place like that will be tight, especially after tonight. Thomas agreed. We'll scout the area first, look for any weaknesses. We can't afford to go in blind. Jasmine's resolve hardened. We have to do this. If we don't, Jason will keep coming after us. Dan nodded. Then we move tomorrow night. We'll prepare during the day. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas and Dan gathered equipment, cameras, recording devices, and anything else they might need to document what they'd found. Jasmine spent hours reviewing the shipping manifest, familiarizing herself with the layout of the dock and the types of shipments listed. As night fell, they geared up and set out for the dock. The drive was tense, the weight of what they were about to do hanging over them. No one spoke, each lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Dan parked the car a safe distance away, and they approached the dock on foot. The area was eerily quiet, the only sounds the lapping of water against the pier and the occasional call of a distant bird. They found a vantage point overlooking the dock, hidden among a cluster of trees. From there they could see the layout clearly. A large cargo ship moored at the dock, its deck bustling with activity. Workers moved crates from the ship to a series of unmarked trucks, their movements efficient and practiced. Dan pulled out a pair of binoculars and scanned the area. They're loading fast, he said. They know time's against them. Thomas set up a camera with a long-range lens, capturing every detail. We'll need footage of the cargo itself, he said. If we can prove it's illegal, we can shut this operation down. Jasmine nodded, her eyes fixed on the scene below. How do we get closer without being seen? Dan considered the question, then pointed to a stack of crates near the edge of the dock. We can use those as cover. Once we're close enough, we'll document what we need and get out. Thomas nodded. Let's move. They crept down the slope toward the dock, staying low and using the shadows for cover. The air was thick with tension, every step bringing them closer to the danger. As they reached the crates, they crouched behind them, their eyes scanning the activity just a few feet away. Dan positioned a small camera on the edge of the crate, capturing footage of the workers loading the trucks. There's the logo, Thomas whispered, pointing to one of the crates. Same one from the warehouse. Dan nodded, adjusting the camera angle. We've got what we need. But just as they were about to retreat, a new sound cut through the night, the low hum of an engine. They turned to see a black SUV pulling onto the dock, its headlights off. The vehicle stopped, and two men stepped out, both dressed in dark suits. One of them opened the back door, and a third figure emerged. Jason. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat as she watched him stride toward the cargo ship, his posture radiating confidence. He exchanged a few words with one of the workers before turning to the men in suits. Everything's on schedule, Jason asked, his voice carrying across the dock. Yes, sir, one of the men replied. The last truck will be loaded within the hour. Jason nodded, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Good. Make sure nothing goes wrong. We can't afford any slip-ups. As the men continued their conversation, Jasmine leaned closer to Thomas, her voice barely a whisper. We need to get out of here, now. Thomas nodded, signaling to Dan. But before they could move, one of the workers shouted, Hey, over there. Flashlights swept across the dock, their beams slicing through the darkness. Jason's eyes narrowed as he turned toward their hiding spot. Find them, he said coldly. Now. The beams of flashlights danced erratically, illuminating every corner of the dock. Thomas, Jasmine, and Dan pressed themselves against the crates, their breaths shallow as footsteps closed in. We got to move, Dan whispered, his voice tense but steady. Thomas nodded. On my count. We split up, create confusion. Meet back at the car. Jasmine's pulse quickened. What if we get caught? We won't, Thomas said firmly, though the doubt in his eyes betrayed him. Ready? Before she could second guess, Thomas counted down. 3, 2, 1. Go. They scattered, each darting in a different direction. Jasmine kept low, weaving between the towering stacks of crates. The heavy sound of boots echoed behind her, the guards shouting as they split up to give chase. There, toward the north fence, one of them barked. Jasmine's heart pounded as she slipped behind a forklift, crouching in its shadow. She could hear the guards nearby, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows across the dock. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. Stay calm. Think, the fence wasn't far, but she needed to time her move perfectly. From her position, she spotted Dan scaling a stack of crates, his movements agile despite his rugged frame. He positioned himself at the top, a small metal object glinting in his hand. A second later, a loud clank echoed as he hurled a tool across the dock, sending it crashing into a pile of barrels. Over there, a guard shouted, redirecting their attention. Jasmine seized the moment, sprinting toward the fence. Her hands gripped the cold metal, and she began climbing, her muscles burning with the effort. Behind her, she heard the guards returning, their shouts growing more frantic. Stop right there, one of them yelled. A shot rang out, the sound splitting the night. Jasmine froze, her heart hammering in her chest, but the bullet had missed, embedding itself in the crate beside her. Thomas's voice echoed from somewhere near the loading bay. Hey, over here. The guards turned, their flashlights whipping toward the sound. Jasmine didn't waste the distraction. She hauled herself over the fence, landing hard on the other side. Pain shot through her ankle, but she pushed herself up, limping toward the dense tree line that surrounded the dock. The cover of the trees swallowed her, and she kept moving, each step fueled by adrenaline. Minutes later, she spotted Thomas crouched near the car, his face pale and determined. He motioned for her to hurry. Where's Dan? She asked breathlessly as she reached him. He'll be here, Thomas said, though his eyes kept darting toward the dock. They waited in tense silence, every second stretching painfully. Then, just as Jasmine's nerves began to fray, Dan emerged from the shadows, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. Let's go, he said, sliding into the driver's seat without missing a beat. They sped away, the dock fading in the distance. No one spoke for several minutes, the tension in the car palpable. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. Did we eat everything? Dan nodded, pulling out the small camera from his jacket. Footage is intact. We've got Jason on video overseeing the operation. Jasmine exhaled in relief, though her mind still raced. It's enough to prove he's involved. But what about Carter Hill? Dan frowned. That's the tricky part. Carter's careful. We didn't catch him on camera tonight, but if we connect the dots, we can make a solid case. Thomas nodded, his grip on the seat tightening. We'll need to move fast. Once Jason realizes what we've got, he'll double down. As they drove, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that Jason wouldn't back down easily. He was too arrogant, too obsessed with control, and with someone like Carter Hill in his corner, the stakes were higher than ever. Back at the apartment, they quickly reviewed the footage. The clarity was better than expected, capturing not only Jason but the marked crates and their labels. The pieces were falling into place, but Jasmine knew they were far from safe. Thomas leaned back, rubbing his temples. We'll send this to my lawyer first thing in the morning. He'll know the best way to proceed. Dan nodded, though his expression remained grim. This will rattle them, but it won't stop them. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. Jasmine glanced at the window, half expecting to see a shadow lurking outside. Do you think they'll come after us? Dan exchanged a look with Thomas before answering. They'll try, but now that we have evidence, they'll be more cautious. We've turned this into a high-stakes game. Thomas's jaw tightened. Then we'll play to win. The hours passed in restless anticipation. Jasmine tried to sleep but found herself pacing the apartment, her mind replaying the events of the night. She stopped by the window, peering out into the quiet city streets below. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the table. She walked over, her heart skipping as she saw another message from the unknown number. Unknown. You think you're safe? You're not. This isn't over. She showed the message to Thomas, her voice shaking. It's him. He knows we escaped. Thomas read the message, his expression dark. Let him play his games, we'll be ready. But even as he spoke, a sense of unease settled over the room. Jasmine knew Jason's next move wouldn't just be a message. It would be war. The air in the apartment felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the storm. Thomas, Jasmine, and Dan huddled around the table, reviewing their next steps. The footage they'd gathered was damning, but it was only a matter of time before Jason and Carter made their move. Thomas's phone buzzed again. This time, it was his lawyer, Brian. He answered immediately, putting the call on speaker. "Brian, tell me you've seen the footage," Thomas said. "I have," Brian replied, his voice steady but urgent. "It's strong evidence, but we'll need more to make an airtight case. We're dealing with powerful people, and they won't go down easily." Thomas nodded. "What do you suggest?" "We need to act fast," Brian continued. "I've contacted a journalist who specializes in exposing high-profile corruption. If we can get this story out before Jason and Carter can suppress it, we'll have the public on our side." Dan leaned forward. "Won't that put a target on the journalist's back?" "It will," Brian admitted. "But she's used to dealing with people like Jason. She's ready to go public, but she'll need an interview with Jasmine to tie everything together." Jasmine froze. "Me?" "You're the key witness," Brian said gently. "Your account, combined with the footage, will make it impossible for them to deny. But I won't push you. This is your choice." Jasmine's mind raced. The thought of going public, of putting herself in the spotlight, was terrifying. But she also knew this was their best chance to bring Jason and Carter down. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm, despite the fear in her chest. "If it helps stop them, I'll do whatever it takes." Thomas reached over, squeezing her hand. "You're brave, Jasmine. We'll be with you every step of the way." The interview was scheduled for the next evening at a secure, undisclosed location. Until then, they stayed on high alert, knowing Jason wouldn't sit idly by. As night fell, Dan's phone buzzed with a message from one of his contacts. "Contact. Carter's people are moving fast. They're planning something big for tonight." Dan showed the message to the group. "Looks like they're trying to get ahead of us." "What do you think they're planning?" Jasmine asked, her voice tense. Dan frowned. "Could be anything. Intimidation, sabotage, or worse. We need to be ready for anything." Thomas stood. "Let's tighten security. Dan, you keep monitoring your contacts. Jasmine and I will go over our plans with Brian." They spent the next few hours fortifying their position. Dan installed additional security measures around the apartment, including motion sensors and cameras. Meanwhile, Thomas and Jasmine reviewed their statements for the interview, making sure every detail was clear and consistent. As midnight approached, a sudden notification pinged on Dan's laptop. He pulled it up, his eyes narrowing. "Motion detected near the building," he said, his voice sharp. Thomas moved to the window, carefully peeking through the blinds. In the dim light, he spotted a black SUV idling across the street. "They're here," he said, his tone grim. Jasmine's heart raced. "What do we do?" Dan grabbed his bag, pulling out a small device. "I'll loop the building's security feed to buy us time. We stick to the plan, stay inside, stay quiet, and let them make the first mistake." Minutes felt like hours as they watched the SUV. The tension was unbearable, every sound amplified in the silence. Finally, the SUV's doors opened, and 4 men stepped out, each dressed in dark clothing. "They're making their move," Thomas said. Dan nodded, his hands flying over the laptop keyboard. "Let's see what they're up to." Through the security cameras, they watched as the men approached the building, moving with military precision. One of them carried a small black case, which he placed near the main entrance. Dan's eyes widened. "They're planting something. Could be a surveillance device, or worse." Thomas clenched his fists. "We can't let them do this." Dan grabbed a radio from his bag and spoke into it. "Unit 3, are you in position?" A voice crackled back. "Copy that, ready to move." Dan looked at Thomas and Jasmine. "Backup's here. We're not alone." Outside, a second SUV pulled up, this one unmarked. 4 more men emerged, each carrying tactical gear. They moved swiftly, intercepting Jason's men before they could enter the building. Through the security feed, Jasmine watched as the two groups clashed. The fight was brief but intense, with Dan's team quickly overpowering Jason's men. Within minutes, the intruders were subdued and handcuffed. Dan leaned back, exhaling in relief. Crisis averted. Thomas nodded. "Good work. Let's make sure they don't come back." The next day, the tension remained high as they prepared for the interview. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel, met them at the secure location. She wasted no time, setting up her equipment and getting straight to the point. "Jasmine, your story is powerful," Rachel said. "Are you ready to share it?" Jasmine took a deep breath, then nodded. "I am." As the camera rolled, Jasmine recounted everything, her encounter with Thomas, the events at the wedding, and the escalating threats from Jason. She spoke with a quiet strength, her voice unwavering despite the weight of her words. By the time the interview ended, everyone in the room felt the gravity of what had just been recorded. "This is going to make waves," Rachel said, packing up her gear. "Jason and Carter won't be able to hide from this." Thomas placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "You were incredible." Jasmine managed a small smile, though the weight of what they'd done was still settling in. "Let's hope it's enough." Later that night, as they returned to the apartment, Thomas's phone buzzed with a message from Brian. "Ryan, the story goes live tomorrow morning. Get some rest, you're going to need it." But rest wouldn't come easily. The battle was far from over, and Jason's next move loomed on the horizon. As they prepared for the storm ahead, one thing was clear: they had come too far to back down now. The next morning, the world woke up to a bombshell. Rachel's expose at every major news outlet, detailing Jason and Carter's corrupt operation, their ties to illicit shipments, and their attempts to silence Thomas, Jasmine, and Dan. The footage from the warehouse, combined with Jasmine's powerful interview, left no room for doubt. A late shipping scandal exposed, high society crime ring uncovered. The headline was plastered across every major news site, with millions of views and shares within hours. Social media erupted, with hashtags like #JusticeForJasmine and #JasonExposed trending worldwide. Public outrage grew as more details emerged about the lengths Jason and Carter had gone to protect their illegal empire. Jason's world unraveled faster than he could react. Within hours, law enforcement raided the private dock and several other properties linked to him and Carter. They seized illicit cargo that included smuggled weapons, counterfeit goods, and falsified shipping documents. The evidence was damning. Jason was arrested in his luxury penthouse, his smug demeanor gone. The footage of him being led away in handcuffs was broadcast live, a fitting image of his downfall. As the charges piled up, racketeering, conspiracy, smuggling, his once loyal associates quickly turned against him, providing additional testimony to save themselves. In court, Jason tried to shift blame, but it was no use. His arrogant sneers didn't hold up under the weight of the evidence, especially Jasmine's testimony. The jury convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. His empire crumbled, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Carter Hill, the shadowy mastermind behind the operation, tried to disappear, but he underestimated the reach of the law. Weeks of investigation uncovered his vast network of corruption, including bribed officials and offshore accounts. Interpol tracked him down in a secluded villa overseas. Carter's capture was a significant victory for justice. His trial was swift, and he faced even harsher penalties than Jason. As he sat in court, stone-faced, the judge delivered a scathing condemnation, sentencing him to 30 years without parole. His network was dismantled, and his name became synonymous with greed and corruption. With Jason and Carter behind bars, life began to settle for Thomas, Jasmine, and Dan. They were hailed as heroes, their bravery and determination praised in the media. Thomas received public recognition for his unwavering stance against corruption. His decision to stand by Jasmine, even in the face of immense pressure, earned him respect and admiration. He used his newfound platform to advocate for systemic change, pushing for reforms that would prevent similar abuses of power. Jasmine's life transformed in ways she never imagined. Offers of support poured in from across the country, job opportunities, financial assistance, and messages of solidarity. She accepted a position with a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping marginalized communities, using her experience to empower others. Dan, ever the quiet professional, returned to his work as a private investigator. His role in taking down a high-profile crime ring elevated his reputation, bringing in more clients who valued his expertise. Though he preferred to stay out of the limelight, he took pride in knowing he had played a crucial role in delivering justice. Even Heather, who had initially been complicit in her family's toxic culture, found redemption. The public scrutiny forced her to confront her own biases and the harm her family had caused. She broke ties with those who supported Jason and began working to make amends. Heather joined a coalition of activists advocating for social equity, using her privilege to amplify underrepresented voices. She publicly apologized to Jasmine and Thomas, their once fractured relationship beginning to heal. Though it would take time, Heather was determined to prove that she could be better. Months later, Thomas and Jasmine stood side by side at a charity gala, their journey having come full circle. The event, organized by the nonprofit Jasmine now worked for, was aimed at raising funds for community development projects. As they watched the crowd mingle, Thomas turned to Jasmine with a smile. "You've come a long way." Jasmine laughed softly. "We both have." They clinked their glasses in a quiet toast, the weight of their shared journey evident in their eyes. "Here's to new beginnings," Thomas said. "And to standing up for what's right," Jasmine added. As the night went on, they basked in the warmth of a hard-fought victory. The shadows of Jason and Carter's cruelty no longer loomed over them. They had faced danger, exposed corruption, and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. Justice had been served, and the future was finally theirs to shape.